Even though ink has been replaced by pixels, the task remains the same: to publish an informative daily account that's comprehensive and adds context to the stories that are missing from the mainstream media. We have so many stories to tell. One thing that is a constant in my career, and that's 51 years and counting, is that I love to experiment with different ways of telling stories. I'm a writer, a producer, a host, and the former editor of ICT, or what was once known as Indian Country Today. I bring to this show some 50 years of reporting, one-on-one interviews with those who shaped the last half century, and someone who sees what happened decades ago as a key part of context for what's going on now. This is Breaking History, and I'm Mark Trahant. Be sure to come back and subscribe or like and see what else is new here. My goal is to look for stories that are enlightening. My first jobs were in video production and radio, but I always considered myself a writer first. The lesson I learned early on is that technology is a tool. It doesn't define how a story is told. Then that's always been the case. I think about what it must have been like for those creating their history on buffalo robes or even the walls of a cave in a petroglyph. I was a teenager when I began editing the Showban News in Fort Hall, Idaho in 1975. That was back in the days when newspapers were just starting to go digital. One machine would let us type all the copy. It would then be produced on special paper. We would cut the images, stories, and headlines into strips with a razor blade, add hot wax, and lay all of this on a page where it would be photographed as a key stage in the printing process. This was considered new technology because most newspapers used hot type, basically blocks of lead that would be set so that it could make an impression after being inked. I was always interested in ways we could speed up the news. How could we share stories across Indian country? I was not the first person to think about this. Early in the 1970s, a group of Indigenous innovators, Richard LaCourse, who was Yakima, Suzanne Harjo, Cheyenne, Odalgi Muskogee, Chuck Trimble, Oglala, Rose Robinson Hopi, and Laura Whitstock, Seneca, created a native version of the Associated Press, writing and sending stories from Washington, D.C., sending them out to tribal newspapers by mail. Holy cow, what a process. The American Indian Press Association was remarkable, but short-lived. There wasn't enough funds, and the IRS determined that it was a press collective rather than a nonprofit. The association formally died in 1975, the same year I was editing Showban News, but no one gave up. Richard LaCourse suggested a regional version. I took the lead on trying to figure out a new way to accomplish that goal. I saw this ad about a car dealer selling a telex machine for $100. Telex was a written communication that allowed you to send the same story to multiple machines. Perfect, I thought. A telex-to-telex message cost very little, so we could write a story in one tribal homeland and it would be instantly sent to members of the Northwest Indian News Association. The only problem? The Showban News had the only telex machine. Everyone loved the idea, but no editor would buy the machine and set it up. In hindsight, I should have known better. We had a hard time getting members to pay their dues of $100, let alone support a telex network. This was kind of an early internet. I had a blast running the Showban News. We always tried to be a major media, an important voice. In January 1979, I went to Boise to interview Cecil Andrus, Idaho's governor and the new Secretary of Interior. We published a complete text of the interview in a 4-page special section. And I wrote an editorial saying it was curious that the Secretary had time to talk to me, but I could not get through to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Forrest J. Gerard. A few weeks later, Gerard called and we agreed to meet in Reno, Nevada. I was always game for a trip to Reno. And even better, my grandparents agreed to go with me. Gerard and I hit it off, and he became my mentor for the rest of his life. It's hard to understate Gerard's role in history. He was one of the first Native Americans to work on Capitol Hill and was the principal author of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, the Indian Finance Act, the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, and he was the first person to occupy the office of Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at Interior. We talked on the phone after that first meeting once or twice a week for the next 40 years. Gerard pressed me to move to Washington and try to make the BIA better, rather than just writing about its weaknesses. I did that, and I learned that I hated working in government, but I also learned a lot about how the system worked. Let me jump ahead now to my most recent venture. In 2017, the Oneida Indian Nation, owner of Indian Country Today, closed the newsroom. Staff was laid off, web pages were no longer updated, and that was that. I started thinking there are 100 ways Indian country today could have made it. That's just as true when I look at my own failed media enterprises, and I do have a checklist of those, starting with the question, if only. If only we had more money for creators. If only we had more funders. If only, you get the idea. The owners at the time, the Oneida Indian Nation, then donated the assets to the National Congress of American Indians. And with that donation, the Oneidas gave the digital publication a prospect for a new future. I agreed to join the enterprise in February 2018. This is what I wrote at the time. Indian country needs a national digital platform for this generation that builds on the work done by so many who created and published Indian country today in its previous lives. The first tribal editor, Elias Budnat, described his paper as a vehicle of Indian intelligence. Even though ink has been replaced by pixels, the task remains the same: to publish an informative daily account that's comprehensive and adds context to the stories that are missing from the mainstream media. We have so many stories to tell. Our mission is simple but important. Solid, factual reporting, great writing, photography that inspires and records, and provide a real service to readers across Indian country's digital landscape. After a series of meetings with the National Congress of American Indians about what a digital publication should look like, how it should operate, and how we could make sure that it was self-sustaining, I took the job in March 2018. We started with 3 employees and a budget of just $300,000. 8 years later, there are more than 25 people who work at the website, and the budget tops $3 million a year. It's been an amazing journey. For example, in our very first year, we knew the election was going to be remarkable, if not historic. In 2018, there were more Native American candidates running for Congress, governor, lieutenant governor, state legislatures, more than ever before. And for the first time, more of those candidates were women than men. So on a whim, I thought, what if I could put together an election night broadcast and bring together so many of the Indigenous journalists covering the races live? The idea was powerful. Everyone said yes. FNX, First Nations Experience, broadcast the election night live for 5 hours from its studios in San Bernardino. And Native Voice One, the tribal radio network, carried it live. We were still owned by NCAI at this point, and I remember going into my boss's office and saying, I need to spend $60,000 that's not in the budget. Another yes. And another opportunity to innovate. Imagine 6 weeks before an election, planning an election night special and only spending $60,000. Our partners spent some money too, but the total bill was probably well south of $100,000. The next morning, I wrote a letter to the staff. If anyone in a news company ever says, I can't find anyone when hiring, I will make them sit and watch all 5 hours. The talent from Indian country is amazing. That same morning, a lot of people asked, what's next? What about a television show? Well, we did that. It airs weekly on many PBS stations or on the ICT website itself. The editorial process was independent of NCAI, but there was a growing problem. Imagine owning a news operation, but by design not having a say in how it did its business or spent its funds. That was the situation that NCAI was in. So we agreed to split. As the Associated Press reported, Indian Country Today has a new owner itself. The company is called Indig Public Media, and its focus is on public service. Today, I serve as the volunteer board chair. ICT is the largest news operation ever in Indian country. Ever. And now this new chapter, Breaking History, using the largest television network in America, and that would be YouTube, to carry stories about Indigenous history, adding context to the things we might have heard about before. Hit the like button or subscribe, and look for new episodes at Indigenous House on YouTube. I'm Mark Trahant, and this is Breaking History.